Thank you.
Okay. Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Assalamu alaikum, everyone, and welcome. I don't think we're going to run out of questions with a topic like this. There's always a lot of questions. Sometimes it's the many answers that can run on. Anyway, I do hope this is a thought-provoking session. And like I said, I do hope we can do some sharing, which I guess can be in the chat box for those of you who are able to use the chat box. Or perhaps you could raise your hand to use the microphone. So we can have a little bit of liveliness. And well done for those of you in advance who will be attending all of the sessions. That's a big commitment. So we're going to start with the basic question, which will probably take a couple hours. Does God exist? But that does branch off into some subsidiary questions. I would like to keep this general. I don't know the religious background of everyone here. Even if we are all professing the same faith background, we still would probably have some different understandings on the nature of God or relationship with God. So I want to keep that term a bit general. The first basic question, assuming there is God or a divine force, what is it? Is it male? Is it female? Is it embodied? Is it disembodied? Does it exist according to the attributes in the Islamic tradition, eternal and pre-eternal, and so on and so forth? That's always a good question to start about by thinking about, but I'll leave that out there in general, except to say that in this discussion, I'm happy to leave space for some multiple views about what the nature of God might be. And I do suspect, again, that even if you do get a lot of people from the same religious background together, we're going to have different perceptions of the nature of God. Now, as a Muslim, so now I'm going to be going down that track. I'm going to be going down that track. As a Muslim, I would say that's because God is infinite, so has an infinite number of manifestations, if you will, whereas we are finite. So if you believe in the Sufi-ish idea that we're manifesting certain names of Allah, then my temperament and character might somehow help me to relate to God, or Allah being the Arabic word for God. I'll probably interchange the two together throughout this. But I would probably perceive or interact with Allah based on whatever is closest to me. So, attributes that I may somehow be more cemented in myself, such as, I don't know, a mirror of divine knowledge, like not the same attribute that Allah has, but the same sort of thing might lead me to perceive Allah more omniscient than, say, more caring, versus someone who's more of a caring person might perceive Allah or God or the divine force as being more of a nurturing and supportive force because that's their temperament. And we're all different. That might be one explanation, or there might be others for why people perceive the nature of God differently. But we all do. And as Imam Ali, peace be upon him, said, if we've encompassed Allah in our brains, we haven't understood what Allah is, because once we've limited Allah, then it's no longer God, because it's a tangible thing, like tangible iPhone. So whatever the divine is, it's outside your tangible thing. So basically, with that nice prelude, I just wanted to say we can keep it a bit general, especially because once you get out of the Abrahamic traditions, there might be more vagueness about what the nature of the divine might be. Okay, that was a poorly phrased sentence, but there might be more variance about what a divine force might be. And also, I don't want to start out with the assumption that God needs to be equivalent to organized religion, because you do find, especially in this day and age, that there's a lot of people who've left organized religion for one reason or another. I think England is a good example. In my experience, not everyone here is really, even if they're born into the Church of England, or a family that's, affiliated with it, they may not necessarily carry that throughout their lives, but there is a sort of a belief in stuff that's out there, so to speak. So I do want to keep those separate issues, but they're obviously quite intertwined, especially if we are taking an Islamic slant on some of these questions. So let us move on. These are some things, inshallah, we can think about today. Is it possible to absolutely prove the existence of God? Why or why not? And the related question, is it possible to prove completely the non-existence of God? Let's take that in the chat box. Thoughts on those questions, especially the why or why not? That's a very wise answer we have from SN Jamil. One can prove to himself or herself, but not to others. And a very cautious answer, but wise nonetheless. One of the reasons that is a quite a pertinent answer here is that most people will take personal experience as having a higher level of value than being told something. So, for example, very simple example, I'm allergic to peanuts. So I have had the personal experience of being allergic to peanuts, and I know through my experience what an allergic reaction is like. Therefore, no person who tells me how wonderful peanuts are is ever going to convince me that they're not an evil and horrible thing. Well, I'm sure they have merits in creation, but as far as my personal experience is concerned, the experiential experience, so that the knowledge by presence, if you will, then that outweighs any sort of transmitted evidence to me. So similarly, people who have personal experiences that lead them to believe in the existence of God, or things that are personally convincing for them, are unlikely to be deconvinced, no matter what someone says, because these are things that they have personal experience of. I'm not really sure it's possible to have a personal experience of the lack of God, because a personal experience of God might be, for example, a mystical experience or a near-death experience, or visions, prayers, like things that demonstrate that someone exists. Just like I have had a personal experience that the Islamic College exists as a place, so I can say it's not just imagination. I've seen it physically. But to have an experience that tells you there is something not existing when it could be anywhere is much more difficult. Although maybe sometimes people might feel that way if they see a lot of suffering, and then they wonder, where is God in all of this? So, but generally the personal experience would weigh towards the existence of God. Okay, scrolling here. Perhaps through reason, logic, and his signs and selves and horizons, many planets prove you. Yes, you can prove to others. I've never thought this is possible because I've always felt God's presence, but I cannot make others feel it. And in this materialistic world where everything should be proven with experiments and observations, I do not find this possible. You can present arguments, but not proofs. Oh, you want my view? I think I would agree with the view that you can present arguments. The Holy Quran presents arguments for the existence of God, some of which we will look at today, God willing. The Hadith also carry on this discussion. The Islamic theological tradition carries it on. A lot of the arguments used by Christian and Muslim theologians, incidentally, for the existence of God, the proofs, if you will, are quite similar. There seems to have been some historical interchange on those points, and there is today still, whether or not we necessarily are always aware of it. But I think it's safe to say that if the world population is divided on this topic, that it isn't an absolute proof that is accessible to people in the same way that I can prove to you that when I plug my laptop into the electricity and turn it on, that it turns on and does stuff. I can demonstrate that very easily. Why is another question. I would incidentally be interested in your views on why is it easier for me to prove something that is material and tangible, like a chemistry experiment or something with electricity or magnets or, this sort of thing, rat experiments. These things can be done and replicated materially, but to do that with the nature or existence of God is much more challenging, and to do it in a way that will convince everyone at the present time is not a possibility. Now, there is a a gray area there. There are people who have attempted to do some sort of scientific study of God, if you will. Um, there's a book I came across once, which I did add a screenshot of it later on, called Testing Prayer, where someone tried to measure the efficacy of prayers for healing. But because the scientific community today doesn't really accept faith-based work, they did have to revise that into social and psychological terms. So sometimes even the ability to test the premise is then situated in the human being, which again gets back to the measurable. So as for why it's a difficult thing to present a proof absolutely for, in the same way that it's possible to present proofs for material things, I think is due to the nature of material existence. Yes, thank you, Lesa Kamithvahi Shea. So because we are material and physical bodily beings, there's it's like electricity. On the power lines, the electricity is zooming along at however the electricity works, and you need a transformer to transform it down. So in a sense, it's like fish trying to prove the existence of water. It is there, but it's somehow outside of their perception to understand that it's there, or there's a big existence outside of the water. They might understand there's a small existence outside of the water. In fact, that's a good analogy, because when someone feels the presence of God, it may be a continual thing, or it may be like those little trips outside of the aquarium when the fishes jump around. But the point being that there may be some, but again, that is something personal and related to the individual, and not necessarily everyone is using those senses. Yeah, God is non-material, non-empirical, hence cannot be directly demonstrated in the material sense, and non-mathematical. And that actually, that takes us down the rabbit hole of attempts to do mathematical proofs of the existence of God, which you may be familiar with. So feel free to add in the chat box. People have tried this sort of thing, but at some point it does become a bit nebulous. That being said, one has to assume, now I'm getting back onto the faith-based track again, but one has to assume that this is how it's meant to be. I mean, the Quran does say, now I'm speaking from a Muslim perspective, that if God had willed, or Allah had willed for all human beings to believe, then we would have. And Allah could have sent down angels to march along and speak to us about the nature of Allah, or somehow manifested something to us that would make us understand. I mean, there are things that have been given to us according to our tradition, like miracles in the past and revelation. So we have things in addition to the existence of the universe to contemplate on. But for whatever reason, the divine self-disclosure is something that is to some degree hidden. One of the things you do see repeatedly in Islamic esoteric literature is the idea of veils to the divine power, that there are certain things that they're kept from us, perhaps for our safety, because we couldn't necessarily endure it, like the mountain could not endure the self-disclosure when Allah answered the prayer of Moses to disclose himself, or perhaps also just because that there is a certain value to it, and so one has to go seeking for it. But finding the truth and acting on it is part of the test. Yes, I would agree with that point in the chat box. So maybe also, this is just my theory, that I do think sometimes some things are kept from us human beings so that we maintain an interest in them. As people, we tend to get very bored with things that we know about. So, for example, exploring the Earth used to be extremely exciting because there were new continents and new places, and no one had ever gone to the North Pole, and you don't know what's in the oceans, and you have the first scuba divers and stuff, and that was all very exciting. Nowadays, you don't have the same excitement for exploring the Earth. I mean, some people are interested in it, but it doesn't capture the imagination because we feel like we've done it and we've Google mapped it. But maybe exploring outer space might be interesting because there's still some unknown out there. So similarly, I feel like that when it comes into the spiritual realms, if you will, or things pertaining to the hereafter, there is still a sort of inherent interest because it is something that's hidden from us. And maybe that's part of the plan for us to care and to actually work towards these things. God knows best. Anyway, let's look at this next question. In your view, what is the strongest argument for or against the existence of God? Let's say someone has challenged you to a debate. Maybe some atheists have challenged you to a debate. Okay, we already have 2 tracks going in the chat box. We have the outer universe argument, so the mountains, oceans, flower parts of the body. I'm going to treat that as an outer universe thing, even though it's technically inside. How they work in harmony. And then we have the inner argument. My consciousness of God is the biggest proof for me. Okay, so now we're on the outer argument track again. Which are basically, these 2 tracks are the tracks that are taken, either arguing through things that are created or arguing through inner faculties. So with that in mind, let's look at some approaches to this question, which you may be familiar with. But this basically reinforces what's going on in the chat box, for those of you who are in the chat box. There's basically 3 main genres of argument when it comes to the existence of God. One is the logical, oh look, we just got a logical argument in the chat box. How can something come from nothing? So you need a first cause or a creator. So there are certain logical arguments one could put forward. I would say that human beings, and I think this needs to be admitted to in this sort of discussion, we human beings are not wholly logical beings or even primarily logical beings. And for many people, atheism is also not a logical choice. I mean, it's oftentimes presented in this day and age as the more logical choice because that's the nature of the world we live in. But in reality, people go for atheism or theism oftentimes for very emotional reasons. Whether they, family issues for against their family or other things in society. So logic, I don't think, is really always the number one convincing factor for people, even though we oftentimes like to say that it is. To some degree, that's because we also have an intuitive faculty, which will sometimes perceive things that we're not able to verbalize or to logicize. So for example, I don't know, you might be investing money. I don't know if anyone invests. I don't have a background in investing, but let's say you're trying to decide between 2 companies, or say get a job. You might have a logical reason why one is better, but it doesn't feel right. So the intuition sometimes will pick up on some things. I'm just putting that out there because it's good to acknowledge the multiple number of ways that we make decisions about things. That being said, logical arguments are a main genre of arguments. And then we come to know about God or the existence of God from what we input. So the transmitted knowledge. So that could be scripture. It could be what we hear from religious leaders and religious representatives, or from members of the faith, from family, from friends, from YouTube, from me, from each other, whatever. So there is what we are told, which has some impact on us, because it's going to, even if someone's not really a strong member of a organized religion, they're likely to pick up the schematic of that way of thinking, from the society around them. And of course, if someone is invested in one of the world religious traditions, then of course, what is, the official teachings are going to, sorry, I'm reading and thinking at the same time. It's going to have an effect. So, for example, many Muslims will look to the Quran for a basic source of the nature of God. And then you have the wholly personal side, which we've talked about briefly, the intuitive or experiential side, which could be a general thing in life, or general feeling, or general knowing, or it could be experiences. I'm just going to put this out there. I mean, don't feel pressured to say anything, but I was talking about a similar subject somewhere once, and we got into the topic of near-death experiences. So I asked, has anyone had a near-death experience? And there were quite a lot of hands that went up, and I was just really surprised because I didn't realize it was that common. It was either them or like their relatives or something. I don't think it was all them personally. But the point is, things happen that we don't always talk about necessarily, but they do also shape our views. So these are sort of the three primary routes. There may be others. They each have their own advantages and disadvantages. As I mentioned, personal experience is usually the most convincing for a human being. However, it's the least communicatable. I mean, I can go on YouTube and explain to someone my personal experience, but it's still my experience. So it may convince others to some degree, but it's not going to convince anyone to the same degree that I convince myself. However, logic is something which is ideally universally inaccessible. Can we further illustrate how we are not so logical as human beings? Dude, just read the news. Or no, to turn on Fox News in the United States. That's a complete demonstration of the idiocy of some human beings. I'm sorry, I hope I didn't offend anyone just now. So pick whatever other news organization you wish that has, how should I put it? Or look online. Look at some of the fake news online or some of the things that circulate online. So we see that there is a sort of ideal of the human being as the rational animal, but that ideal varies from person to person, and also because humans are born irrational. I mean, I've heard there's an evolutionary argument for this, and that is that first of all, in the big life or death situations, which would pertain to natural selection and the continuation of a human life, a human being will do better, on an instinctive or intuitive decision rather than sitting there and trying to make a rational decision. Big animal looks like it's going to eat me. What should I do logically? That's not how we work because it's part of our survival mechanism, and I suspect part of how we're bonded as families, or apparently human history was quite tribal throughout much of history. There is probably more of an emotional imprinting component and less about logic, albeit in this day and age, sometimes logic tries to rearrange some of that. Is Trump the most famous example of Trump is the most famous example of a rational being? I would actually say no, personally, because he actually got himself to the presidency. So I'm sure he's got a well-oiled mechanism going on in his brain, and he's got all that money and stuff. I mean, it depends on what you mean by irrational. I mean, maybe he is. I mean, maybe he got himself there through irrationalism. I guess just my sense is there's a method behind the madness, and sometimes presenting yourself in a certain way in public. It's a public decision. It's a stage personality, and maybe not always reflecting what's going on the inner human being side. But I don't know. You could be right, but I'm sure there are others. Yeah, okay, so we've got other divisions also here too. That's fine. These are all just suggestions on how to handle the topic. Can what we hear be taken alone, with or without logic and reason or intuition and experience? I think it depends. I mean, when it comes to the Quran does encourage people to think and consider and explore and to look inward and to look outwards. So, from that angle, although not all Muslims necessarily have an ethos in this day and age of questioning, and there isn't always a lot of tolerance towards questioning the faith, nonetheless, I would say in and of itself, it's not a book designed for someone who's in a dark room with just a flashlight to read the book, who's never going to go outside or interact with the world. There is some encouragement to use it as a springboard for greater understanding through the created world. So from that angle, I don't think the Quran can be taken alone. And there is, there are logical arguments for the nature of God and other things in the Quran. Um, but I'm not sure. I think, I mean, certainly we do see some failures in uh, Islam and Christianity in particular, and I guess probably Judaism too, and other religions as well. When people do simply parrot things without thinking, and they just take stuff on board and do it, we see that unfortunately on the world stage this day. Groups like ISIS and so forth. So in a sense, it's certain things are heard, but there isn't apparently a sort of solid intellecting and intuiting about it that might. But I mean, I can't like judge what all these people are thinking, but one gets a sense from the ideology that the ideology is simply taken without questioning. So that's sort of it is blind faith in an ideology. Um, okay, I'm pondering on Asad Jamil's questions. I mean, everyone's also different and has a different capacity and level of interest. Um, so I think it's a good question. I'm going to not weigh in on that right now anymore because I wouldn't want to give an answer that's not complete. So I'm not certain. But yeah, I do think in general, for most people who have an interest in this sort of subject and question, and um, they have the mental capacity to be able to discuss it and so forth, then probably all three routes somehow get combined, but for some people, based on personality and life experience and environment, you're going to have more of one than the other. Like, someone who's genuinely raised in a non-religious household and a non-religious environment, maybe somewhere where religion was very suppressed, like during some of the communist regimes, and didn't really hear a lot about scripture in their immediate environment, probably isn't going to be as much influenced that way. I mean, they probably still will be, culturally and so forth. Versus someone who is growing up, say, in a religious family or has a religious education and so forth. But yeah, I mean, logic in the human being is interesting. I mean, people will have a logic for anything, but it's not always correct logic. It's sometimes false logic. So, for example, if someone sees something supernatural or atypical, and then they say, because of this, I know that Jesus saves, they've asserted something based on their background knowledge. And you do hear that quite often, by the way, at least in some places. They've asserted something based on their background knowledge that seems logical, but it is a false argument because it requires belief in an outside premise. All they really know logically is something unusual happened to them. Yeah, these are all very complicated issues. And I guess that's why it's interesting. Like, on the one hand, the nature of God is outside of the human realm in the sense that God does not have a dependency on the human being, from an Islamic perspective, at least, there is a sort of absolute separation on an existential level. But on the other hand, the way we interact with these sorts of things, and definitely questions of religion, is deeply human. I've come to feel that religion, is inseparable from the human experience because so much of it is not only about the supernatural, but it's also about things that bind us together, whether it's a shared belief, shared practice, shared understanding, shared arguments, shared logic, and so forth. Um, yeah, inshallah. I think, of course, the challenge these days, by the way, I was responding to the comment in the chat box. I think these methods are probably sequential as well, possibly. By the way, I bet you're slanted towards the logic side just from that comment. Once I have believed in the Prophet, sallam, assuming if I were in his age, then I will submit to what I hear from him. Yeah, there is an if there. I mean, one of the big disagreements among Muslims today is that we aren't in the era of the Prophet, and even though there is textual evidence, we still have sometimes varying understandings of what ideals he would have taught. And again, a lot of that comes from Zone B, what we hear. And especially when it comes to sectarian differences, it's because there's a bifurcation in what we perceive to be the ideals taught by the prophets, so, or any of the other hot topics that the Muslim world is embroiled in, big ones that I don't need to mention. But it's interesting to think about, and you can think about what is most, most valid for you, and what is most valid for other people. A good skill in life in general is to try to be able to step out of our own framework and mold, if you will. Each of us will be more inclined one of these ways or another, and to be able to understand that people are different, not only in their personality and background and so forth, but how they interact with the world. I feel like I'm getting into the personality types discussion here, so I'm gonna move away from that. But I do think, I don't know if you guys have heard about like the oh dear, what do you call those? There's personality types. There's 4 letters. It's introverted, extroverted, thinking, feeling, perceiving, judging. But the point is, I'm sure if you type personalities in some sort of rigorous way and then somehow investigate them, how they perceive God or religion, you're probably going to find some correlation between people who have one set of approaches and one set of another. Yeah. Thank you. Myers-Briggs TI. I don't remember what that stands for. Anyway, anyone who has an interest in that, you can, and if you're not familiar with it, you can Google it. But we've already got 3 people who are familiar with it. Okay, I'm going to scroll up. When it comes to the senior ulama, such as the Maharaja, are we moving into a new era? As following blindly on some of the statements, rather than fatwas, will there be a movement more from this? That's a big question. The short answer is God knows the future. I can give you my prognostication on the future. I think that's going to be a yes and no sort of situation. I mean, it does seem that with the quote-unquote era of democratization of knowledge, so, higher access to basic secular education, which, if you think about it, you go back like 100, 200 years ago, even basic literacy rates and access to books was so much lower that the average person, who was receiving a fatwa is not really going to argue about it. I mean, I even remember back in my olden days, and yes, I'm feeling so old these days. I was born in the 70s, and I remember I first saw a physical book of hadith, because they didn't have e-books back then, or internet. I was probably 20, and I just picked it up like this sort of thing, like, it's a different sort of thing, and of course it's quite valuable because, this is what the Prophet taught, but it wasn't the sort of thing. Maybe I was 18, but the point is, it wasn't the sort of thing that was circulated everywhere, that everyone is going to have, and you just go online and search Bukhari and you get your stuff like you do today. There's just been such a rapid jump in the availability of information and the educational level needed to process it. And then, of course, you add to that the number of people, with access to higher education, where there is an expectation that you are going to be able to produce and engage in research. And it's very natural to therefore want to take that into the religious sphere and say, well, if I can come up with a suitable argument about, I don't know, medicine and prove something, then why can't I engage with the religious texts? So that expectation has been growing. And I don't think, it's not there for everyone. And again, I'm going to point out that some people don't care. You care because you're here. I mean, at least some of you care. But there is, quite a lot of people who are busy with other parts of their lives, and they just want to be told what to do so they can get on with whatever their intention is on. Maybe they work in, I don't know, nuclear research or something. They don't have the time or the brain space or the interest to really dig into the religious questions. That constitutes a good bulk of the Muslim population, people who have other priorities. But there are people who do want to have answers. And I suspect, so where I was going, I think there will be a bifurcation between people who have a sort of traditionalist view, if you will, which is basically just do and don't question, versus people who do want more answers or maybe who are going to question certain answers. And I suspect that depending how the rest of the world situation continues in the next century or two, if we're all viable here in the next couple centuries, probably that distance will get greater. So we'll have multiple movements, just like in the past, you have, for example, among Shi'is, the Akhbari and the Sunni movement, or among Muslims, you have Sunnis and Shi'is. I think also, I suspect that unless we have some sudden improvements on a global scale, if the political situations continue as they are, the climate change concerns, there may be other outside issues that push these sort of questions, and there may be a sort of reprioritization. I mean, if severe changes in how we are living due to climate change affect us, then that naturally would probably affect the way that we're dealing with religious inquiries, or what sort of religious inquiries are given priority. But maybe not. I mean, Muslims have gotten through a lot of really rough times in the past. So I don't know. But so basically, I think it's a yes and no with respect to the new era. I think some people are moving into a new era, but not others. And it just remains to be seen how that's going to play out, and where the religious power centers are going to remain. I'm not aware of any prognostications that, Azhar, for example, is going to lose prominence, although maybe it would. In the Shi'i world, for example, some people have suggested maybe Iran will end up being the religious power center for various reasons. But I can't even say that for sure. So God knows best. Before I dig my hole any deeper, I'm getting out of this. Interesting how the Dawa people are also really realizing this and trying to ignite the fitra. Yeah, as opposed to pushing arguments down people's throats, appealing to emotion. I mean, you could debate whether fitra is emotion. I would actually treat those as separate things. The fitra, for those people who are not familiar, is what is discussed in the Islamic tradition as the inborn nature of the human being. So it would be, for example, ethical and moral teachings, which are universal. For example, truth, justice, this sort of thing. Dislike of injustice or lying, not accepting murder and theft, that sort of thing. So universal morality, and also the acknowledgement of God and the innate tendency to worship God. That's a very interesting subject in of itself, but insofar as if these things are believed to be patterned inside the human being, then to some degree I would say that's separate from emotion. It's just like if I go to hit you and you flinch, that's an instinctual thing, not necessarily an emotional thing. It's just part of your patterning. But there is a similarity. But that also gets back to what I was saying, that logic is not always the most compelling thing for people. Although it's, yeah. Okay, I'm going to let you guys talk about the Marja'iyya on your own, because it's a big subject. Yeah, by the way, for those of you who are not aware, the Marja is the Shi'i person who gives fatwas, like the top rank religious leader. And the Marja'iyya is that system. How often do we question doctors, but we do ensure he or she is good enough? Yeah, I'm gonna leave that one there. There's no taqlid. You don't know what kind of experiences I've had with NHS. Let's put it that way. But I guess that does. I guess you can just put that under the rubric of how do we ensure we do ensure he or she is good enough. I mean, then that begs the question of, does one question, can it be just shunted into the other question? Okay, there's no taqlid in aqaid. Okay, it looks like you guys are doing fine having your own conversation. That's cool. I'm reading the conversation. Yeah, it does seem to some degree there is a trend towards specialization of the Marja'iyya with respect to specialists in different topics. And to some degree, this may be a trend in the future. There's a greater acceptance of it nowadays, although still there is a popular sense that the one marja should handle everything. But yeah, it may be in the future, different marjas will be specialized in different areas, especially if there is a push for more of, what are considered new subjects, like things related to medicine or biomedical technology or environmental issues, that maybe you're not always going to have one person who's professing to be the most learned on the subject, but then that does lead to sort of a different question of how it, yeah, I will finish the digression. I think it is relevant. Like I said, these things are all tangled together. It is difficult as a human being in human society to discuss the nature of God without getting into organized religion. And divine authority and religious authority are also entangled. And the way we receive information from religious authorities is entangled in all of this. And then, what if people have differing opinions? Their intuition says one thing and what they hear says something else. Okay, but yeah, there is some evidence that specialization may become more popular, but then there's the question of whether or not that would really be accepted by people. I mean, one of the strengths of the Marja'iyya is in the sense of a single leader, who is kind of perceived as being a stand-in for the Prophet or the Imam. And so if you have a committee of 10, that doesn't quite have the same pull to the masses. I mean, it may for people like you and me who understand why, Ayatollah so-and-so might be more specialized in, finances and economics and that sort of question. But I think, I'm not sure that would be a viable system on a popular level. However, we'll just move right along to the next question. Rational arguments for the, sorry. I'm going to reset myself now. Rational arguments in the Quran and Hadith for the existence of God. You guys have already talked about some of them, so we will just look at them physically. We can look at them. One of them being the existence and complexity of the natural world. We will show them our signs in the horizons and within themselves until it becomes manifest to them that it is the truth. By the way, I can't see the whole screen, so I'm kind of guessing how that might be translated there. But yeah, have they not pondered upon the creations of the heavens and the earth? So that is a very fundamental argument in the Islamic tradition that, hey, there's all this stuff and it's very beautiful and complicated and consistent. You don't have one set of laws of the universe here and then you go to Mars and they're somehow different, and you go to another galaxy and they're different. We have a basic assumption as human beings that there is going to be stability and consistency throughout the visible universe. And one could say this is part of the fitra, or the inner nature. We expect it to be ordered. We expect it to be discoverable. If we see something that doesn't fit in, for example, with a theoretical prediction, you don't say, well, God was having a bad day and just sneezed. We say, oh, something's wrong with our theory, because we have a sort of inborn faith that the universe will be ordered. And that in of itself, there's no particular reason why we should have that sort of view. And in fact, that's one of the classical arguments against polytheism, that if there were several demigods, each with their own arena or whatever of creation, then you would have clashes, because they wouldn't be doing things in a way that's systematic and orderly. They'd have maybe one set of constants, mathematical constants here, another set of way of doing things there, which I can't even imagine what it is. And then they wouldn't be conducive to life anyway. So the existence of creation is a big thing. And also we had in the chat box the argument that something needs to have caused the universe, because everything has a cause or an origin. So if you've got like people, you have a biological father and mother, or something happened in vitro, but you've got a cause there. And eventually they had a cause and they had a cause, but something had to start it all up, because things don't emanate from nothing. Even if you have an argument where somehow the universe, big bangs into existence, well, where did all that energy and matter, or energy at least, come from? Where did this potential come from, so to speak? That sounded a little bit unscientific. But anyway, the point being that something needs to have started something. Now, there are some failings of his arguments. Now, we can talk about failings. Yeah, I'm going to pick up on that though. Do you think there's a link between having natural surroundings and man-made surroundings and impact on people's belief in God? I actually put that out there. Do you all think that there is an impact, a link between having natural surroundings versus man-made surroundings and belief in God? Well, no one's expressing thoughts on that yet, but hmm. Okay, Sharif, how does it have an impact apart from definitely? Okay, so we have absolutely in man-made environments we're seldom reminded of God's creation. We're reliant on man-made systems. Yeah, I would concur with this. I think that one of the downsides of mass urbanization, and especially the uglier side of urbanization, is that, yeah, as you're saying in the chat box, we simply do not see the creation on a regular basis. I mean, you take something as simple as the stars or the moon. Well, you don't really see them in London that much anyway, but I mean, there's so many people who just grow up never seeing these things. Whereas you go back, before there was street lights and electricity and so forth, and it would have been just a perfectly normal thing that you see a lot of stars in the sky. Um, and so, that sort of sight really invokes a lot of wonder in you, and a sense of beauty and appreciation. Whereas if you look around, like, I don't know, just somewhere that's very gray or run down or whatever, you don't feel a sense of optimism or beauty and, wow, this is Allah's creation. Yeah, the same thing with other natural areas like forests, for example. I mean, they're very beautiful, mashallah. How much time have I spent in a forest in my life? Very little. But I think it's probably very different for for the generations that grew up as the norm. Obviously, some people do today too. To actually see how the natural world works together and interact with it and understand the complexity of it. Whereas in this day and age, there are kids who grow up saying things like, "Mom, wow, did you know that chicken is the name of an animal and a food?" Awkward moment. Yeah, onslaught of mental illness, being away from nature. I do think that has an impact. For some reason, I think do tend to be better off. Well, not just I think, there is evidence that we are better off, with more exposure to things like trees and greenery and the natural world. So I do think that is one step away from the science of creation. And also, I do think that we have a false sense of reliance in the urbanized and industrialized world, a false sense of self-reliance, which I do think the COVID situation broke down a bit. That is to say, because we are accustomed to having certain things through certain systems of production and delivery and certain financial systems and so forth, that we do feel a sense of independence, which I don't think the average farmer who was reliant on the rainfall or is, I don't want to say was, but I'm just saying for masses of people there is a disconnect from that. There's maybe a bit more appreciation about things that are outside of our hands when one doesn't have the sense that everything is under one's control. And yet, the COVID situation has shown us that, these systems are easily disrupted, and we can't necessarily assume that they're always going to be in place all the time. On the other hand, of course, man-made creation can teach us about God's creation, since the creative act is and the act of creating, fashioning, and designing is, a sort of way to mimic the divine act. And so I can understand God as the fashioner if I see, for example, an architect working or someone else designing something. Yeah, I agree. I mean, I think pantheism is a different issue because pantheism is more like what shade of theism are you going to be talking about, whereas atheism is, I my sense is it was a minority movement up until the modern era. There were definitely atheists, um, but it wasn't the norm, and for some reason it has become more of a norm. Although even then, I wouldn't say it's a norm. Maybe the norm was more about going away from organized religion in some places. Also, the Quran does emphasize, or it does talk about the natural world quite a bit. I mean, the Quran does talk about animals worshiping Allah and being aware of Allah, and Allah offering the trust to the mountains. And, so there's a sense, talks about the bees. We all know the stuff the Quran talks about. Well, most of us, I'm sure, know the stuff. I don't want to make assumptions. But the point is, there is a sense of aliveness and participation in the animal kingdom, and also plants and the stars and the earth and so forth, and in the perception of God and the worship of God, and having their role in a purposeful cosmos, which is another big question. Does the cosmos have an inherent purpose or not? And this is one of the biggest psychological or emotional challenges of atheism, is it's very difficult to have a sense of purpose in one's life, or human life, or earth, or anything else, without having some sort of theological framework, and especially a sense of something persisting beyond this life. If you have a large group of people which just believes this life is the end, and that is it, and we're material beings who evolved somewhere and then die, I'm not going to say they're all going to be amoral or something, but just there is a different. I think it very quickly can lead to a sense of despair, or a sort of nihilism or sarcasm, or just a sort of gray existence. Whereas a framework which sees the human being as part of a tapestry of existence, and one of many beings which are aware of the divine, and which has further steps in evolution to go after this life. It does give you a different perspective on your life. Now, of course, that's not an argument for theism or atheism. I'm just pointing out that there is a very clear psychological effect there. Yeah, I would concur.
Sorry, we lost Sister Amina. I hope she can come back somehow. Uh, I think her internet is probably disrupted, your internet connection. I would suggest that we would all leave and come back, because I think we're having some issues at the moment. So we're going to end it at this point and ask everyone to come back again. Would everyone agree? Oh, she's back. She's back. So come back, please. Sister Amina, yeah, you're back on.
Yeah,
Okay.
sorry, I was saying my computer doesn't like all that atheism.
Okay.
Yeah, so anyway, I was just pointing out that atheism, to find someone who professes that, is in of itself a rather well thought out religious commitment, and most people, again, just are not going to be bothered to sit there and really profess why I am an atheist. There are just atheist people who's like, I don't care, like, I can't be bothered, or they're just so embroiled in other things in life that they're in practice atheists, but that's just more of an apathy atheist. And even it's interesting, like you listen to some serious. Okay, I was listening to a serious professed atheist once who's like, why God doesn't exist. It's like, by the way, I believe in ghosts, and I saw a ghost once. Like, okay, so that gets to how you discuss an atheist. Is an atheist someone who doesn't believe in anything non-material, or they just don't believe in God in a sort of Christian sense? Because this guy was from the Midwest in the U.S., which has a heavily Christian influence. A lot of people still believe in stuff out there, even if they're not like accepting God from the organized religion viewpoint. Although I do think, well, not I think, but it does vary a lot from place to place. Yeah, in general, at the time of the Prophet, atheism wasn't the main competitor to Islam, if you will, but rather it was degenerate polytheism and a lot of ritual and superstition and idol worship and so forth, as well as personal problems such as arrogance and so forth. Do you believe there are arguments from the atheists proving God doesn't exist? Well, no, because a proof is absolute, and a proof is something that everyone will be convinced by, or at least 99% of people. I mean, there's always going to be like, I met someone who was quite happy with the flat Earth model once. He was quite serious about it, and I was like, okay. I mean, I guess if it works for you, that's fine. But most of us are convinced that the spherical Earth model is more in keeping with measurable reality. So the 99% is a good, what's the word, measure for people convinced by a truth. But the fact is, atheists will put forward their arguments, and theists will put forward their arguments. And a lot of atheist arguments are not very, they're not foolproof. You can go through some of their lectures on YouTube and so forth, and start to poke holes in some of the false premises. And one of the challenges is that people are bringing in arguments which are relate to the ideas about religion they got as a child. So say someone who's exposed to Christianity as a child is probably going to have a strong belief that religions are mutually exclusive. So there's one true religion and every other religion is wrong. That's not necessarily, that's just simply not actually a viewpoint held throughout much of human history or by much of the world. And then when you come to Islam, that there is space for Judaism and Christianity. And, we found some merit, in the time of the Prophet. They believed in Allah, but they had other problems. So you don't, although Islam is an exclusivist religion in that the Muslim view is that Islam is right, that there is nonetheless space for other people and faiths. And I'm not saying every Christian sees Christianity as the true religion and nothing else is true, but that is a dominant worldview that is associated with the Christian heritage. I'm trying to pick my words carefully, but I think you get my point. So for an atheist to argue, for example, it doesn't make sense to say there's a right religion or there is a God, because what if I pick the wrong religion? That's based on a false assumption they're bringing up that came from their upbringing. That is not at all logical or absolute. But you have to pick through what people are saying. But basically, no, we have not proven it wholly, but you can make arguments, and some people do shift in their viewpoints. Has anyone made a major shift here in theism, from atheism to theism, or theism to atheism? And why? If you have, feel free to add it in the chat box. Um, so, I mean, Sharif mentions one in the chat box. Once an atheist whom I knew, once who was a thief, admitted when the police was after him, he prayed sincerely to God. People will do that. I mean, as the Quran says, when people are on the sinking ship, they become sincere believers. As they say, there are no atheists on the battlefield. Or as they say, as long as there's exams, there will always be prayer in school. So, I mean, it is human nature. But of course, when we're out of danger, oftentimes people go back from that. Not always, oftentimes. Yeah, so there was a lot of but in what I was saying. Yeah, so a perennialist philosophy does give a less exclusivist view of religion, but that's not what most people who are exposed to, like, conventionally, say, I don't know, in the American South. Or I'm not quite sure how Christianity is presented here, so I don't want to make like statements. There is at least a sort of idea in many people's minds that it is an exclusivist religion, but even if not every person has held that view. That's what I was getting at. Okay, so then we had the fitra, going back through the Quranic things. Are we seeing my screen? Or not? Yeah, so I think Islam does. Oh, wait, I don't want to get into the religious pluralism topic. I forgot this is a hot topic and a inflammatory topic. Yes. Without getting into any particular individual's views on religious pluralism, I will say that there are two views on religious pluralism in Islam: yes and no. Some Muslims are not very much in favor of religious pluralism, and some are. So I would say that this shows some flexibility in how the Quran is interpreted. I'm not saying there are multiple interpretations or multiple truths here, but I'm saying that in the absence of the Prophet, one can take it in more than one way, and so it is at least a potential to look at it. Certainly, if I can impose my own views here, in virtually any major or minor-ish world religious tradition, with some exceptions, but in general, you're going to have a lot of the same core beliefs and values. I mean, yes, there is difference in the frameworks associated with them. Like, Islam is situated in the Abrahamic framework. Well, so is Judaism, but the understanding of what that means as a Jew is going to be very different from what it means as a Muslim. But nonetheless, you have belief in purpose in the universe, a creative force in the universe, that there is an efficacy to prayer, perception in non-material ways, that there are people who are inspired, or maybe they have visions, and that sort of thing. It's a set of ethical values that truth is valued, honesty, hard work, etc. I mean, you're going to find similar things at the authentic core, and I know that's a problematic phrase, but the authentic core, or maybe you can say what is best of any world religion. But in this day and age, a lot of that has degraded into ideology, whether it's nationalist ideology or identity politics. And that's really where we get a lot of the clashes in this day and age. It's not always really about foundational issues. I mean, take Islam and Christianity, just because that's very simple. The basic belief in God is not that dissimilar. I mean, obviously there's issues with the Trinity, but the basic idea of having a scriptural religion and certain things, that there's enough crossover that there was philosophical and scientific crossover between the Muslim world and Christendom for quite a long time. And yet in this day and age, there is a perception of a clash of civilizations, but that is largely due to politics and identity. It isn't due to some sort of fundamental difference in the religious narrative that makes people want to kill each other. It's about everything else. And this feeds into that. Oh, we've got exciting things in the chat box. Yeah, thank you, Shoja. Well done. Sorry, I hope that wasn't condescending. But yeah, I definitely could not have said that better. Do you believe mainstream Shia theology has had influence from the Shia philosophers, or are we still basing it off specific? Sorry, I'm sounding bored. Specific hadith and Quran, and if not, will our theology grow to incorporate this more? That's a good question. You know who's going to answer this question? Mr. Tehani, don't you have a graduate degree in Islamic philosophy?
No, I don't have a degree in Islamic philosophy. I've read Islamic philosophy and I've edited Islamic philosophical texts. So
good enough for me. Go ahead and give
yeah.
us an answer.
Well, do you believe mainstream Shia theology has had influence from the Shia philosophers, or are we still basing it off the specific Hadith and Quran? And if not, will our theology grow to incorporate this more? Well, Shia philosophy has had more than Shia philosophy. Shia Kalam has had an influence on Shia theology. So all the experts on Kalam, they have almost defined the parameter of the Shia theology. So Shia philosophers, for up to a point, their influence over the past 14 centuries have been rather limited up to, if you want to, for instance, take the example of Mullah Sadro. Only recently Mullah Sadro has been able, his tradition has been able to exert some influence on Shia theology, especially after the Islamic Revolution in Iran, which was headed by a philosopher who was a theologian himself. So, many theologians would probably stay away from traditional Shia theologists would stay away from philosophy. That's my understanding.
Thank you. Sorry to put you on the spot there, but
no
it's
problem.
Fine. Okay.
I'm glad I wasn't dozing.
Yeah. So we have more answers in the chat box. I don't think it's I don't think it's always I don't think influence is always obvious. In the sense that someone who is exposed to some framework might have it affect their work in one way or another, even if they're not directly basing it on that. You look at other frameworks, just like, for example, assumptions about the nature of the cosmos. That has really nothing to do with theology per se, and yet that's very much going to affect our discussion. Like I referred to the Big Bang Theory, or the sense of a purposeless material cosmos. That's very different from how ideas that would have been circulating about the cosmos, say, 1,000 years ago. And so the frameworks we're around do influence us, whether or not it's direct, but sometimes it is direct, as was pointed out in the chat box. Al-Ghazali, yes and no, basically. The thing about Al-Ghazali is the stuff that is hadith based is based on the Sunni hadith, so some of it is not necessarily going to imply into a Shi'i worldview, but as for the sort of reflections and approach, it's going to be yes and no. Just like with Ibn Arabi, it's going to be yes, some Shi'is, yes, others absolutely not. So it depends. Okay. Yeah, and as for the direction of Shi'i theology in the future, that's a good question. I'm not going to prognosticate on that because I really don't know. But if any of you want to prognosticate on the future of Shi'i theology, feel free to add it in the chat box. Okay, so we're not even on the Fitzroy yet. Yeah, so we mentioned briefly the argument via the innate human nature on the existence of God, which we may or may not have time to get into in this session. But that is, at any rate, the Quranic argument for the existence of God, that it is something that is inbuilt inside of us, and so all we have to do is reflect or remember this. I think sometimes you can take this for granted. If you are a practicing Muslim and in swimming in that ocean, that you don't stop to think, why is the Quran called a dhikr, for example, a reminder? Or why does the Quran speak about reminding people? Because we mentally translate it into that it's just the Quran, and we don't always stop and think about it. But when you have to explain to someone else why the Quranic text is using this, then it does, bring up the underlying belief that, according to the Quran, everyone took an oath expressing the existence of God, which tends to be understood as being somewhere in pre-creation. I mean, there are a minority of people who will say that maybe that relates to something that happened, throughout human maturity, like maybe when someone matures past puberty or has basic intellectual maturity, that maybe they naturally would accept the existence of God. But it is generally taken as something to have happened in some prior realm of our existence. And so therefore, in a sense, we don't need to be taught about what is right and wrong or the nature of God. And you see already I'm conflating those two, ethics and morality and God. But because they are instilled in us, and we just might get confused sometimes. But that is one of the Quranic arguments, which must have been compelling for some people, because it's been compelling still to the present day. Yeah, are you guys familiar with Pascal's wager? That's heavily philosophical stuff. I don't know, ask some philosophical people about defining the Akal. Sorry, I didn't mean to brush it off. It's a good question. And I was being like a bit sardonic there, but it is a good question, because some people put that stuff very heavily in the realm of spiritual cosmology and first intellect, and I don't know, second and third, and etc. And then for me, it's just like, well, the rational faculty of the human being. Hey, good one. Yeah. Okay. So, yeah, Pascal was a 17th century mathematician, after whom the computer language of Pascal was named, which probably no one ever uses anymore. Yeah, and his basic idea, which is on this screen, is much simpler than what's on the screen, which is basically, let's say it's a yes or no issue. So he is coming from a environment of exclusivity of religions. That is, God is or isn't. If God is, and you accept that and live accordingly, then you stand to win eternal happiness. So you might have some finite loss in, I guess, restricting yourself from all those sins and indulgences and so forth, but you have a possibility of an infinite gain. But if God is not, you only have a finite loss. So therefore, statistically speaking, you'd ought to wager that God is, because you're going to lose less in the end. Yeah, I don't know about YouTube. You have to ask Mr. Tehrani or the admin. I kind of think it's nice, to be honest, to keep these sessions private. But I don't know about YouTube, and also I don't know if the chat is recorded or not. I think it might not be. I'm not sure.
As far as I know, the chat is not recorded.
Yeah, so you got some privacy in the chat. But yeah, Imam Sadiq presented Pascal's wager to an atheist before Pascal. Yes, it is mentioned in Hadith, as I put here. If it is as you say, and of course it is not, then both of us will be saved. This is speaking of someone who denies a creation and end of the universe. However, if it is as we say, which of course is the truth, then we will be saved and you will be destroyed. And the guy couldn't handle that, and he apparently died soon after. Yeah, so basically that's his argument. Does that work for you? It works for some people. Ooh, that's a good point. We have a -1 for Pascal. Doesn't Islam require you to genuinely believe in God and follow Him? Would you be saved if you just didn't commit sins to avoid risk? I don't know. God knows best. I mean, you're not going to end up as deep in hell, probably, if you're a bit cautious about what you're doing. But yeah, that's a good point. That's not really the point. And I don't think he was saying that's the point. It's just an approach to the question. But yeah, you can poke holes in it, but it's an interesting thought and approach. One of the holes you can poke in it is that well, it's not a hole, but like Islam in and of itself doesn't make you choose between this world and the hereafter. In theory, one should have a good worldly life, or one can, and a good hereafterly life. Of course, certain things are forbidden in Islam, but they aren't things that tend to make people happy on a long-term scale. I was reading an internet post by this guy, not in the Muslim community, as far as I know. I thought it was quite sad today. He he's suffering from chronic pain, and he said that he doesn't want his pain to be cured because he wants more of the painkillers, because basically he's addicted to the painkillers, and he was wanting to know basically how he can get more of them. But if his pain were cured, then he wouldn't have access to them, and I thought that was really sad. But the point is, like, drugs are haram, and people don't get happy from having addictions. It just brings misery on people. So, as Muslims, at least, we believe that the things that are prohibited in Sharia are prohibited because they will ultimately bring unhappiness, either for the masses or for the self. I mean, an individual might get happy if they go and kill a bunch of people and steal their money, but it brings misery to other people. So you don't have to choose necessarily between this world and the next life. In theory, I'll leave that out there for you. But these are kind of minor issues. It's not the only argument. It's just one. I'm scrolling. My husband embraced Islam as the truth based on rational arguments, like design of the universe, the first cause, as well as his innate fitrah. That's nice. Of course, Shias believe the Imams knew the nature of people they spoke to, so gave the arguments most appropriate for their personal psychology. Yes, I would agree on that too. A probabilistic argument still will be good for some. Okay. This is all very interesting. Mr. Tehani, are we supposed to continue with this subject, or do we stop and have more exciting discussion with microphones?
Do you have more slides to go through, or are you done with your presentation?
I could continue, but this is the sort of thing that it can be a bit organic too.
Okay. Well, I suppose we could open it to Q&A. I mean, more focus rather than scattered questions. So if people could number their questions in the chat section, or open their of course, raise their hand first, and then we will allow them to discuss, to raise their question. I think that would be much more dynamic, hearing their question from themselves instead of in the chat line.
I agree.
Any questions? Well, we appear to have a shy audience. Anyway, if people do not have any questions, we'll bring it to an end here. But if there are people who are not willing to, or who are rather shy, they don't want to ask their question, maybe they can put their question in the chat line. What is the responsibility of an ordinary Muslim to preach others about the existence of God?
It's a good question. I'm not certain I know, in a sense, of one answer applicable for every single person? I mean, my understanding is it's a communal responsibility, but whether or not that involves every single individual in the same way, I don't, I'm not sure about that because everyone's in different circumstances, for one thing. And different people have different capacities to communicate well and to influence people. And, we all know some people who just really should not be doing this sort of thing because they have no empathy and they don't have social skills and so forth. So we kind of, hope they would not do it too much. I mean, the prophet encouraged people to share the message. In the Shia tradition, the imams encouraged people to share the message, something that tends to get a bit lost in the Shia community, especially in this day and age. I'm not sure why, because it's quite apparent in the textual tradition that it is something that is encouraged and praised. If you lead someone to Islam, you'll have a place in paradise and so forth. But whether that means that every single person needs to do it in the same way, I don't think there's any evidence for that view. So I would say it really just depends. And also we have our own levels of understanding. It's a good question. I mean, my gut answer would be if it's something someone feels called to do, whether it's inside of themselves or due to the circumstances that they're in, then there is a sort of responsibility, but not everyone might be in that situation all the time. Like if you grow up in your village back in the day before they had cars and trains and stuff, and you die in your village and seen your whole village your whole life, and maybe you go to the next village. I mean, are you going to be seeing a whole lot of different people to be arguing about the existence of God with? I mean, they've probably discussed it. You've probably discussed it. So that's a little bit different than, say, someone who gets up and goes to another country, which we have in the Hadith collections. I'm not implying people didn't move back in the day, but I'm just saying, I guess what I'm saying in part is that although there was a lot of dynamic theological discussion and interreligious and intercultural discussion back in the day, there's a lot more exposure to different people and places in this day and age because of the transportation technology and communication technology. So that does place us in somewhat different circumstances than some of our forebears who, probably had a more limited sphere. So that maybe makes it more of a meaningful question in that sense. Like anyone can go on Twitter or Facebook or whatever as long as they have an internet connection. But yeah, I would still say the baseline is I don't think there's a specific responsibility unless it's a sort of urgent situation, like being tortured for your faith, or if someone is in need of guidance, but it is something that is praised. How do we socially approach the different ideas of God or the lack of ideas about God? Let me just scan the other questions first. We could go through the slides. We could. I think the presence of the Hujjat Allah fil Ard in public changes the situation. Well, the belief among Muslims is that when the Mahdi arrives, he will provide irrefutable proofs. There's some evidence that there may be different religions at the end of time still, for whatever reason, people just don't want to change. But I think that especially if all of the narrations, or not all of them, some of them at least, are correct about the signs at the end of time, voices from the sky and the sun rising from the west and all that, I think people best will believe that God is out there, especially if you do believe in the Raja and that the dead come to life, some of them anyway. Because if that's not proof that there is a little bit more out there than we expect, I don't know what is. Okay, I'm being facetious. We have seen that some advances in technology do mimic some of what is predicted in the signs. Maybe some of these things will be technological or whatever back then, and they won't be inexplainable through material causes. But it is held that he will provide proofs, and the people who fight him are just going to be the ones who are adamant and won't accept anything. And will bring knowledge as well. Presumably that knowledge, includes scientific knowledge, but also other forms of knowledge. Do miracles of prophets and their successors represent just another argument to the people, or are they a proof? I think the problem with miracles is that people forget very easily. And I don't mean like they forget 1,000 years later. And like, believe me, you show someone a miracle tomorrow, really hardened atheist, they're going to be surprised. Wow, what was that? You know, I don't say miraculous healing, for example. And then a week later, they're going to be like, I don't really see that. Or, you know, maybe I was dreaming or hallucinating, or, you know, I had some, you know, food poisoning. They're going to question it because, you know, and even if they see it recorded, they're going to say, well, did someone, you know, Photoshop that or edit it or whatever you do with the recording, special effects. So the point is, people will forget very, very quickly if they're not willing to accept it. So for that reason, I would say miracles only work for people who have some innate openness to accepting what goes along with the miracles. But if not, then they are a form of proof, but they don't convince everyone. And even we see that in the Quranic narrative. You know, for example, in the time of Moses, was the Pharaoh convinced by his miracles? He wasn't, because he wasn't willing to make space for that sort of thing. Whereas some other people around him were convinced because they were a bit more open-minded and were able to be convinced and not just, you know, consider that maybe we didn't see this clearly or whatever. Islamic view of perennial philosophy. You guys are asking some questions that are topics of debate. I want you all to bring that up at one of the other webinars.
Irrelevant.
It's not irrelevant, it's quite relevant, because if you are talking about is our religions mutually exclusive, but then I would say that actually ties in quite well. And does God self-manifest through different religions? I mean, I'll say a tactful answer. There are Muslims who advocate it. You know, Sayyid Hussein Nasser, for example. Will all Muslims agree with that? No. I would say I would say consider it on its merits and come to your own conclusion. Take what is good and leave the rest, etc. But yeah, do bring it up in one of the future webinars and let me know what they say. Is evolution a strong argument against God? I don't think so. Now, I would qualify that by saying I'm raised in the evolution generation, for which evolution was normalized. Some Muslims, especially those not in the evolution generation, are quite sensitive on this point and are adamantly against evolution. I mean, it's a theory; it could be wrong. But I'm just saying that there is a cohort of Muslims which does not see it as an either-or question, because as the creator, God can fashion the human being however he wants, and that can be with evolution in mind. And at the end of the day, one can take the idea of Adam being created from clay as the fact that we are all earthlings, or if you guys are into, you know, either stories or gaming, earth golems. You know, we have earth constituent, whatever, earth stuff in us. You know, we eat the stuff that comes from the earth and we go back to the earth. And so we're like walking, shambling earthlings full of water. So in that regard, we are very much made out of clay. Now whether that's a sort of, you know, literal fashioning out of clay, or sort of arising up and being molded, or whether that's a sort of metaphor for the process of evolution, it is something there will be some disagreement on. If I am correct, there was recently a conference on this in like Denmark or something. I forget where, but maybe some of you heard about it or even heard the papers there. But I will say this is not something there's agreement on. It's just, you know, I presented my bias that one can find harmony with these things, but some Muslims will not find harmony with these things. How can intuition, experience-based approach?
About the evolution, if I may add, there are Muslim theologians and Muslim thinkers who believe that evolution is not against the teachings of Islam. So in the Iranian context, Dr. Yadullah Sahabi wrote a book on the conformity of evolution with the Quranic teachings and the Hadith. And therefore, there are Muslim thinkers who do believe that there is no contradiction between the theory of evolution and Islamic teachings.
Excellent point. I would add to that also that evolution is still a theory. So, if you're going to base theology on a theory, which I'm not saying anyone is doing, but I'm saying if someone decides evolution is right and therefore what do we believe theologically, that's a sort of backwards argument, at least from a scriptural religious basis. Rather, you should believe in Allah somehow as the creator and evolution as possibly right or wrong. Just because I'm saying that there is a tendency in this day and age to take scientific theory as the absolute truth, even when it's about things where there is that there is some scope for discussion, because none of us were there back in the early days of human history, or just like none of us was there at the beginning of the universe. We do our best to model, but the models may change over time.
And this is not limited to the Islamic context. In the Christian context, there are also thinkers in the Christian context who believe that evolution is not against the Christian theology. You can read the works of Tilak de Chardin, who wrote extensively on evolution while he himself was a Christian thinker.
Thank you. I'm looking upwards in the chat box now. We still have to go back to the missed things. As if miracles aren't a good method, then why did God send them at one point? I think we have a good answer in the chat box. They were relevant at those points, and the ocean was split out of need rather than to prove a point. I mean, they have a purpose. They just don't seem to be the longest lasting purpose, or independently sufficient for all people. They are sufficient for some people. Have any of you seen or heard anything miraculous in your lives? And you guys are all free to answer or not answer. And then the corollary, which I wouldn't really ask you to share unless you wanted to, is how did that affect you and your faith or your beliefs or your life direction? Well, for some people, it will have a very profound effect. Some people, for example, will convert to a religion because of something seemingly miraculous. And then some people, like I said, they'll just be like, oh, well, what did I eat last night? They're not ready to be changed, and nothing is going to change them. And the Quran does mention that some people have sealed hearts, and Allah has, well, anyway, that the truth is not going to get in anyway. Okay, I'm going to scroll up. How do we socially approach the different ideas of God or the lack of ideas? I'm going to give you a very subjective answer, because I don't think this is a one answer for everyone sort of question. I think it's good to try to begin from a position of understanding and trying to recognize what other people believe and why, and what underlying frameworks and worldviews there are. So, for example, as I mentioned, the assumption that religions are mutually exclusive is a worldview that is prevalent in the West. I don't think everyone has it. We've had exceptions, but it's prevalent, and I don't think it's prevalent traditionally in Japan. So you've got worldviews, and not to superimpose one's presumptions about how society and religion work onto other people without having some sort of dialogue. I think this is oftentimes where interfaith discussions tend to fail, when even if people are using mutually understandable words, the underlying assumptions and concepts and sometimes values are different, and so they're not actually able to have a meaningful discussion. So I think trying to be able to get a comprehension of what is going on the other side can be helpful. I do think that in many cases the discussion is really about faith versus absence of faith, or religion versus absence of religion, which again are not necessarily the same sorts of things, although there is a link. I think most Muslims have probably moved on. I remember, for those of us who were in Islam and modernity last year we talked about this a bit, that in the 20th century, a lot of Muslim polemicists and apologists did tend to treat Islam versus the West as Islam versus Christianity. And, again, in my lifetime, I've heard many Muslims attempt to discuss things with quote unquote the broader society on the assumption that everyone in the West is a practicing Christian or cares about Christianity or knows about the Bible or knows who Moses is, and etc. And yes, there are going to be people who care about these things, but there are a great many people who don't necessarily care about these things. And, if you're in a country with compulsory religious education, they might know about these things. But that's not necessarily going to be everyone's paradigm, but rather the main paradigm is basically theism versus materialism, or theism versus scientism in the mid 20th century. I think that's waning in this day and age. But you still have organized religion versus, I guess, private spiritualityism and secularism, which is a different sort of dialogue. So maybe see where the dialogue is. Are we actually talking about God, or are we talking about other issues of human life and structuring human society? I think it's nice if we can have an abstract discussion about God, but these other issues do tend to creep in. So basically, do your best. But that's my advice, and of course, you guys could put your advice in there too. Be polite. Pick your battles. Not every verbal battle needs to be fought. Certainly, at least in the Shi'i Hadith corpus, there are Hadith encouraging people to engage in good debates and discussions, and telling people know when to be quiet, basically. And you want to get that from the Quran as well. So, pick the discussions that are going to be fruitful. Don't argue with people who are not demonstrating soundness of mind, etc. That's not the right phrase. Don't argue with someone who's not willing to be convinced at all, unless you're just doing it for the audience to listen. Sometimes that's the point of a debate, so that other people listen. Okay, how can intuition experience be used as an approach to prove that God exists? It can be used as an individual proof, and it can, I guess you can say, lend credence on a statistical level. Like if you have 80% of people saying they've had personal experiences of God, then that might make the 20% wonder. But it's not the same sort of universal proof as argument of God being the first cause or intelligent design. Those are more logical proofs. It's a bit in a different zone in terms of proof. But I just was giving it a little bit more space because on an individual level, and at the end of the day, we are universes in our bodies and selves and souls and whatever we will. With, I guess, I don't know how it works if you're conjoined with a twin or something, but in general, we are separate beings. So in a sense, if I'm convinced in my universe, that's good enough for me. But it's a good question. Can we get a copy of the presentation? There was nothing in the presentation. But inshallah, if you remind me at the end, I can upload something so we don't forget. So I don't forget. Alhamdulillah, we have the ongoing miracle of the Quran itself. That is a good point. So what are some features of the Quran that are treated as, or that are understood to be miraculous? Because there are other miracles attributed to the Prophet. Orientalist views that he didn't do miracles, notwithstanding. You can find them in the Sunni and Shi'i Hadith collections. A lot of miracles attributed to him on things that are fairly common sorts of miracles, one can say, throughout history. Like food that feeds more people than it would be expected to, or food that's unending, and that sort of thing. And yet these are not usually given the same priority to us as the Quran as a miracle. So why? What is miraculous about the Quran? To you personally, not to other people around you. while you guys are typing, I'm just going to ruminate on the next question. In your opinion, what do you think is the best way to spread this message of God being theology of Shia Islam? Wow. I'm not exactly sure what you mean. So feel free to clarify what you mean, and maybe others might have some answers in the chat box. Do you believe there's one? I mean, if I can unpack that a little. No, I'm not going to try to unpack. So feel free to specify more, and especially why Shia Islam as opposed to Islam as a whole. I mean, I think there is a certain nuance when we are discussing varying interpretations of Islam, just because it avoids blanket statements. Like a friend of mine from a Sunni background was doing a presentation a while back and was talking about Islam and how Muslims completely believe in predestination and there's no free will. Of course, even among Sunnis, this discussion. I was just like, awkward moment. I mean, like, I'm not gonna, didn't want to interrupt her, but it's like, what opinions over here? You can't, like, a lot of people won't realize there are deeper differences between what has become dominant Sunni views and other views. Not even within Sunni views, obviously there's variety, but I'm just saying sometimes there's a tendency to just present things as a blanket statement because someone hasn't been exposed to various views. And you know what's really funny is that person just sent me a text message right now. That's when I looked over there. And I was thinking, like, oh, I hope she's not here. She might not remember it, though. I remember it. But that's why I'm saying sometimes it's good to be specific, like Shia Islam, although even again, there's a lot of diversity in Shia Islam. Yeah. Well, I mean, sorry, scrolling. Oh, thank you for the link. Okay, we have Ayatollah Motahari's view on evolution. Okay, I'm going to assume that sort of argument is discussed in the book linked above, so you can consult it there. Yeah, there are arguments for and against, theologically and logically and otherwise. And I would say that, again, this is the sort of thing that I think most of us can't erase our own bias from our own time. As I mentioned, I grew up in a place and system that included evolution as part of the basic curriculum and never heard any convincing argument otherwise, so I can't erase my bias there. I'm not saying that makes my view wrong. I'm just saying it's going to be, I guess I'm tactfully saying that the older generation, in my experience, like the older generation and before, is a little bit sometimes more resistant to this sort of thing, and it's not part of their cohort. And to get to the truth without those sorts of personal upbringing and experience sort of things, and to completely push them aside and deal with it sort of in a genuinely both scientific and theological way can be challenging. I don't mean this as a criticism of him, it's just human nature. That this, it's an argument, but it's not taking everything into account, and it's not taking, oh dear. Here I am arguing. I'm not going to argue. I'm just going to say that, okay, it's a point, and I can't say 100% who or what is right and wrong, just as Mr. Tehani said that there are theologians today who support evolution as part of Islamic theology, and there are Muslims who don't, and that there's an argument for not.
Okay, on that note, I think we can bring this discussion to an end. In the chat section, please note that I have given the reference to Professor Ali Paya, Professor Ali Paya's lecture on the subject of evolution, the debate between Allame Muhammad Hussein Tabatabai and Dr. Yadullah Sahabi. This paper was presented at the sixth International Conference on Shia Studies, which was online on the 13th of March 2021 this year. And I'm sure at some point the papers for this conference will be ready, and we will have these papers collected and edited available online as a copy to be purchased. This paper, which was presented by Professor Paya, is, to the best of my knowledge, the best available exposition of this debate in English, in the which you will be reading, inshallah, when the collection of articles come out.
Inshallah.
So that, in a way, answers some of the question that people might have had regarding Murtaza Motahari's, the late Murtaza Motahari's views on the evolution. His views probably corresponded with the views of his master, Allama Tabatabai. But I personally do not know what his position was. I'm assuming that since Motahari himself was involved in the academic world, he probably had some inclination towards this theory of evolution. But again, I do not know, because he considered Allama Tabatabai as his master, and he was very much influenced by him through and through. Without further ado, first of all, let me thank Dr. Amina Inloes for her presentation, and also thank all the participants who have taken part in this 2-hour session. Thank you for your patience, thank you for your contribution, and thank you for enriching this discussion. Please do come tomorrow for the second presentation. You can go to the college website and read about the subsequent 11 or 10 lectures that will be presented. So, Salaam alaikum, everybody. Khuda Hafiz, Ma salama, adios, arrivederci.